When my mother passed, I was living with my brother at the time, and he was like, "Hey, I'm going to go visit our family this weekend. Do you want to come?" And I said no. And I went and did my own adventure. And that was the last weekend that my mother was coherent before she went into her hospitalization. And so that decision to say, no, I don't want to go, I want to go do my own thing this weekend, guilted me for years and years until I eventually came to terms with, well, the reason I didn't go is because I had a really challenging relationship with my mother, and she wasn't always the healthiest person. And I was actually filling my resiliency cup up that weekend, which prepared me to further deal with the great onslaught of challenges that was about to await me. For me, my way through the guilt now is really the book, The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz, the chapter, Always Do Your Best. And the premise is, if you know that you are always doing your best, you can't be guilty for what you should have done. And to me, a part of always do your best is also always be kind. And in addition to always being kind, also always having good boundaries. So I can be kind and I can have healthy boundaries to not have people who are unhealthy for me in my life. And knowing that I did my best to be kind to myself and to that person. And if I have the boundaries, it's in a kind way, then it has given me a lot of closure on not needing to riddle myself with the what ifs and the guilts. Welcome back.
Yeah, great to be back here with you.
So today we're talking about regret, guilt, and the what ifs in the context of grief.
Yeah. I'm so glad we're taking the opportunity to talk about these feelings in particular, although, as we've said before, and I'm sure we'll say again, there's so many feelings that come up in the grieving process. These regret and guilt and the ones that kind of can hang around them, shame in particular, can be such an uncomfortable and I think even a complicating part of grief.
Mm-hmm. You were talking about the neighborhood of regret and guilt. Do you want to sort of lay that as the groundwork?
Sure, great. Feelings in general are pretty conceptual. Right? We have ideas about when they are appropriate to come out, when it's the right time to feel particular feelings, what feelings are given the context that we're in, et cetera, et cetera. And so there are genres of feelings that I think of that hang out together, like the ones that are in the joy and happiness zone. There's some that are in like the gratitude zone. There are some that are in the disquiet zone. There are some that are in the anger zone, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I think of this as being a kind of zone too. I'm thinking of it now like a zip code. So like from remorse and regret and in one kind of end or area of the zone to chagrin or embarrassment, humiliation in another neighborhood that's close by, to like real guilt and shame. And you can feel how they're related to one another, even though they tend to come up in slightly different circumstances. So for instance, particularly talking about guilt and regret here, regret tends to come up, not always, but tends to come up for most of us around the idea that looking back on something that we did, we probably could have done something different. Probably would have preferred to have done something different. Maybe really wish we'd done something different. Guilt tends to come up and can come up with regret or instead of regret, but it tends to come up more when we have the sense that we did something actually wrong. Maybe it's morally wrong, ethically wrong. We just really have the sense that we don't agree with how we behaved, which is different than just that sort of looking back going, it probably would have gone better if I'd done something else. Can you feel that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Have you experienced some of both in your grieving process?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that The regret can almost be a hindsight is 2020. If I had known that would have been the outcome, I would have done this in this way. And then the guilt is more of a, I should have called, I should have reached out, I should have said goodbye, I shouldn't have chosen to do this own thing for myself. I find that they're both often rooted in stories of, for me at least, wishing I hadn't taken care of myself or done this thing for myself in this way
Mm.
in order to not miss out on an opportunity to have the final moments with them or to say goodbye when there was no knowledge that those were the final moments.
Right. Yeah. It really can get so complicated in our minds as we review it. And I think that hindsight piece is really important because for so many of us, we don't know at the time that this may be our last moments with the person that we lost, or that, even if it's not the last moments, it might be the ones that we remember the most, or where we think, looking in hindsight, there might have been an opportunity for something different to have happened that might have resulted in a different outcome. And that's where I think it can get really painful, where it gets into the, if only I had done this, or what if we'd done that instead, or, if I could have helped them with that or the other thing. I think that can get really uncomfortable.
I have an example of that. I have a client who was taking care of her elderly sick mother, who it was known that she was on her deathbed and that she was elderly and in the process of dying. And she was in that process for several weeks. And the mother ended up dying in her sleep around 2 a.m. And my client was so riddled with guilt that she didn't check on her and didn't go to be by her side in that moment. And she really wished that she had operated differently. And if you look at this from a logical point of view, the client actually did absolutely everything right. She was there by her mother's side as every moment she possibly could have been for weeks as she was going through her dying process. But because she wasn't there in the exact moment of death, she had this sensation that she could have prevented it by
Mm.
calling the paramedics and
Right.
extending the life for whatever the cause of death was in the 2 a.m. in her sleep. And it took her several sessions and weeks to work through this emotion of guilt that she wasn't there the moment she died, guilt that she wasn't sleeping in the bed with her mother, that she chose to sleep in her own bed in the other room.
Mm. Mm.
Even though, had she been sleeping there, she likely would have slept through it because she died peacefully in her sleep. So it's such an example story of, even if you're doing everything right and the person is dying of old age in the most ideal circumstances at the age of 100, this can still besiege you.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I think that's such an important thing to exemplify and to spend a moment talking about, because we really can feel guilty about so many things, and the guilt doesn't necessarily mean anything about reality. It doesn't. It's not because of a particular truth. It's just a feeling that we're having that then our mind starts working around and verifying and confirming with facts that we can collect. So I think it's important to realize our guilt may not be based in reality, even though we're still experiencing it.
Hmm. And then in that example of that client and her mother, there was that's a casebook study of kind of like the perfect way to die, isn't it? Dying in your sleep from an old age.
Mm. And after being tended so well by your loved one.
Yeah, by her like five children. So if that client who did everything right and whose mother had the most ideal dying circumstances still experienced guilt, imagine what someone with complicated circumstances before the person died might go through, or who perhaps had a strange or complicated relationship with the person who died, or who perhaps got in a fight with them right before they died, even though the rest of the relationship was really wonderful.
Yeah.
So just kind
Yes.
of layer, though all of those things can layer and layer onto the the guilt burden.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Or, even, gosh, there's so many elements that can be in there, like if they, the person that we loved who passed had a substance abuse issue, or, issue with substances. I don't like to use that word abuse, really. Has any kind of issue with substances, and we had the sense that we didn't intervene enough, or they had an issue with a partnership that ended up being related to their death and we didn't intervene enough, or they had, a lifestyle that somehow was involved in their death and we didn't try to do enough to change them or help them. Like we can really run ourselves through a range of proverbial ringers with this feeling of guilt that comes up, and it's so natural, and regret too, both of them
Mm-hmm.
hang out with each other. I think it might be useful. There's a couple of researchers, Margaret Miles, Alice Demi, who identified some different types of guilt that are pretty common in grieving processes. So I'd like to name those, and then maybe if you have stories or ideas or thoughts around any of them,
Yes, please.
hear back from you. So one of them is causation guilt, like where the survivor has the sense that they are somehow responsible because of something they did or failed to do for the death of the person. So am I somehow at cause because I did or didn't do something? Another one is what they call moral guilt, where the person believes that the loss is some sort of punishment for something that they did previously. This comes up a lot around the loss of our children. We think we're being, people tend to think they're being punished, or a loss of their partner. There tends to be this sense of punishment for something they did previously. Role guilt is a third form that they named, where we have the sense we weren't a good enough brother or father or mother or sister or spouse or whatever it is. I definitely have some of with my brother who passed. There's survivor guilt, which is the one we're most commonly used to hearing about, where it's just the sense that maybe we, the grieving person, should have died instead of the person who actually died, or we have guilt come up just because we survived and they didn't. This often happens, particularly in situations where the people were together when one of them passed, like through an accident or something like that. There's also grief guilt, where one feels guilty that he or she is not grieving well, perhaps because of poor coping strategies or not. And then there's recovery guilt, where they have the sense that they're coping too well. They're moving on too fast. Do you have experience with some or all of these?
Absolutely. Where to begin?
Yeah.
Which one did you say is the most common?
I think survivor guilt tends to be the
Survivor
most.
guilt. Yeah. Yeah, I think maybe we should dive into that one first. Yeah, I certainly have a lot of experience with this one. I have lost, I think, 4 members of my community since
Mm.
2020 to suicide. And I think that suicide is one of the most challenging griefs to grieve because it's so complicated. And I think that almost all survivors are riddled with guilt when it comes to this because there's that I wish I had called, I wish I had reached out, I didn't realize how much they were suffering. I wish I was there in that moment, especially people who have a missed call from the person anytime within the past month of the person passing that they didn't return the call of. Oh, I should have called them back. And I often see a lot of people who are grieving posting on social media things like reach out to your loved ones, call your loved ones, tell them you love them.
Mm.
And yes, you should do that. And we're all humans with certain degrees of capacity. The reason we don't call people back isn't because we hate them, it's because we're at capacity. And in that moment, we had to honor that we were at capacity, and we don't have capacity for everyone and everything. I have a dear friend who passed from suicide about a year ago, and her best friend died of suicide about 3 years before that. And she had a missed call from him. I think about 2 weeks before he ended up dying. And it actually was very, very sad how it drove her to be a very unhealthy self sacrificer for all of her friendships.
Mm.
So, anytime any of her friends were in any form of distress, she would drop everything and show up for them to the point of her own harm. And then she actually ended up dying by suicide a few years later, which to me shows this lack of moving on from that guilt, that the guilt actually eventually took her and succumbed to her, which
Mm.
is the worst case scenario in all of this, that you never want the guilt to riddle you for so many years that you self-sacrifice to show up for everyone else because you don't know what mental state they will be in. So she took it to an extreme, the call your loved ones and reach out to your loved ones and make sure you're there for them and make sure you show up for them. She took that to an extreme, to her own tragic ending,
Mm.
which is why it's so important to recognize it and to move forwards from it and to not let it overtake you, to not fall into that trap. And also, survivors of suicide are a lot more likely to also die from suicide themselves. And I think that this can be one of the triggers behind that, is this survivor guilt, them never being able to move past it.
Mm. Mm. Yeah.
This episode is brought to you by the Center for Emotional Education and Sacramento Reiki Center, where we support full-time grievers every day. Many of our clients have tried everything and it still hasn't been enough. After our work together, they gain the tools and skills that they need to navigate their grief on their own. You can get more information at sacramentoreikicenter.com and centerforoemotionaleducation.com.
Oh, it really gets into how complicated it can be for us when we have a ongoing, especially really uncomfortable feeling that is so close to someone else's death, how
Mm-hmm.
that can really bring up our own survival reactivity to have us go into a mode like that where we're just,
Mm-hmm.
we can't get out of it. And then our nervous system decides kind of for us that it's just easier to not be here. That's
Mm-hmm.
such a painful place to be. And like you say, I think it's really important when we recognize that we're experiencing some regret and some guilt and going into the what ifs or the if onlys, that we name it as such, that we attend to it as such, and not just let it begin to kind of run us in the background.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And, as we said already, the guilt and regret in particular will probably come up anyway, whether you did everything right or not. And recognizing that that's going to be part of the process, I think, is really useful. And then looking for, is it one of these types can also, I think, be really helpful in just helping us to make sense of what's happening to us
Mm-hmm.
and as a way to help process through it. I do think so many of us experience survivor guilt, no matter how our loved one passes, especially if they pass quickly, especially if they pass tragically, especially if they pass by suicide, and or if we were there at the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's one of those types of guilt that we can that is just broad, just by being someone who's still alive when you're someone that you have cared about so much is gone. There's a level of that kind of guilt that just seems so readily available.
Mm-hmm.
So many of us are going to experience some level of.
Mm-hmm.
I have experience with the role guilt, like having the sense of having not been a good enough friend to my brother, there enough for him, or like as good as he was to me. I think that's another way that one can really show up. They were so
Mm-hmm.
good to me. They did so much for me. Where was I when they really needed me?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have experience with that one too?
I
Role guilt?
think that one's not coming to mind in this moment.
Okay.
I think the one that comes to mind in this moment is, maybe you can put this in the category. When my mother passed, I was living with my brother at the time, And he was like, hey, I'm going to go visit our family this weekend. Do you want to come? And I said no. And I went and did my own adventure. And that was the last weekend that my mother was coherent before she went into her hospitalization. And so that decision to say, no, I don't want to go, I want to go do my own thing this weekend, guilted me for years and years until I eventually came to terms with, well, the reason I didn't go is because I had a really challenging relationship with my mother, and she wasn't always the healthiest person. And I actually had a really great time that weekend. And my cell phone was off and I didn't get any of the notifications that she was being hospitalized. And I was actually filling my resiliency cup up that weekend, which prepared me to further deal with the great onslaught of challenges that was about to await me. So it took me a lot of years to let go of that guilt of not going to see her when I was asked if I wanted, if I even had a ride.
Yeah.
So which category does that one fit into?
Yeah, I wonder. It depends maybe on how it showed up for you. Like, were you not being a good daughter by doing that, or
Certainly.
so that might be kind of role
Uh-huh.
related. But maybe there was also this level of, like the kind of moral aspects, like you weren't doing the right thing.
It's that I didn't get to go and be there for her final moments of coherence. Because when she was in the hospital, she was unconscious most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't get to have her final moments of coherence with her.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's interesting. So like the way you relate to it, do you mind if we
Go
talk some
ahead, yeah.
about this?
Yeah.
Hearing you talk about it, it sounds like you had the sense that you did what was right for you and what was
Mm-hmm.
like for the best. And there's this sense of you still missed out on something that you would have really liked to have gotten to have with her,
Mm-hmm.
or a
Mm-hmm.
closure piece. That sounds more like regret to
Yeah.
me. Does it to you?
Yeah.
Hmm. Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very interesting.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I eventually came to terms with it because I actually realized that just a few weeks before that, her and I were on a camping trip and we actually had a really wonderful time together. And we actually, for the first time ever, started evolving into an adult relationship together. Whereas previously it was very mother-child relationship, where sometimes she was the mother, but sometimes I was the mother because it was a complicated dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
But on this trip, we kind of had some really real conversations about who I was and who she was. And I realized that was actually my closure piece that I got. And I thought I would have needed it the final moment she was alive or she was coherent, even though I was at her bedside constantly in the hospital.
Hmm.
So, yeah.
Yeah. What about, did you have in any of the grieving processes that you've been through, and I know that it's not like you're done, but up to this point, have you had that sense of like the kind of guilt that can come up where you're like either coping too well or not coping well enough?
I've had whispers of it. I've had whispers of it, but I think that I have done a pretty good job at recognizing guilt and not succumbing to it.
Hmm.
And then with my friend who I alluded to earlier, who died by suicide, I was not actually surprised or shocked. And I just kind of processed it. And then I saw, and she was, I think, my third person who had died by suicide within that 2 year period. So, in one sense, I was just kind of like frozen from it. I was just, oh, another one.
Hmm.
But for so many people who it was their first major loss in their whole lives, I saw how eaten up and destroyed they were about it. They were getting tattoos like in her honor. And it was the most community grieving events I've ever been invited to was for her death. It's her birthday. We're going to go do this thing. It's her death day anniversary. We're going to do this thing. It's her first memorial. It's her second memorial. And I got to a point where I needed to say, I don't actually need to go to that. I don't actually need to go to her birthday honoring bonfire. I'm actually okay. And there was a hint of guilt of, oh, you're grieving too well. Why aren't you so destroyed like all of these other people who are destroyed by it?
Yeah.
For me, my way through the guilt now is really the book, The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz,
Mm.
the chapter Always Do Your Best. And the premise is, if you know that you are always doing your best, you can't be guilty for what you should have done. And to me, a part of always do your best is also always be kind.
Mm.
And in addition
Love
to
that.
always being kind, also always having good boundaries. So I can be kind and I can have healthy boundaries to not have people who are unhealthy for me in my life. And knowing that I did my best to be kind to myself and to that person. And if I have the boundaries, it's in a kind way,
Mm.
then it has given me a lot of closure on not needing to riddle myself with the what ifs and the guilts.
Mm. I really appreciate that. Yes, yes. I've definitely experienced some of both grief guilt and recovery guilt in that, like, I'm someone who does emotions for a living. I help other people with their emotions for a living. I teach
Yeah.
about processing emotions for a living. And I've been doing that for 17 years. So I know I have tools and I use my tools. And there is this sense of, at both ends of the spectrum, when I'm really in the middle of a deep grief wave and, like, I don't want to focus on anything else. I don't want to take care of anybody else. I don't want to do anything else. There is a little bit of that comes up for me around, like, well, like, you're supposed to be someone who, like, does the feeling so well that, like, you can, like, get through any feeling. And I've had to remind myself, it's not the first time I've thought of this. In fact, it's part of my mission, but I've had to remind myself that part of my mission is not to just always show up placid and calm and content, but to make space for feelings and feelings processing, to, like, even for myself, to allow that and for me to go where I need to go and to do what I need to do in processing my guilt. I mean, my guilt, my grief, and even my guilt around my grief. And so that's, like, I've questioned, like, is this too much for my family? Am I am I going on to, like, do I need to clean this up? Do I need to, like, do more to be more available to clients and things like that? And I've had to, like, tend to myself around that and really take care of myself around that guilt. And then on the other side, like, there are definitely days when, because I've been working it so well, I'm, like, having lots of other feelings like joy and pleasure and curiosity and engagement and absorption and relief and deep, deep love, even around the person that I recently lost. And sometimes in those moments, I'm like, did I get over it? Did I get over it too fast? Am I like, did I mess up? Am I not, is it not still there? Am I not still honoring Edward, my brother? So definitely toggling between those somewhat and having to tend to myself at both ends. And I think some of what you're talking about around really making the effort to do our best and recognizing that we are doing our best has been so helpful as a balm, more in between those extreme moments, but also as a kind of anchor in those, at the ends of those extremes. However, it's looking now, and whether that's really great or really, well, whatever the opposite of great is, I want to say awful, but I don't know. There's something really beautiful in the grieving process too, which we can talk about another time. Wherever I am with it, though, like, recognizing that I'm doing my best, even in that, even in the grieving.
Yeah, I think that if if that's truly not available for someone, it can also be very helpful to talk to a professional about what happened and have the professional reflect back to you. Wow, it sounds like you really did everything in your power, given your knowledge, given what you went through. I didn't hear you do anything unkind or
Mhm.
wrong or to hurt them. It sounds like you were just operating with the information that you had at hand, and you didn't do anything wrong. So there's not actually a reason for guilt. And having
Mhm.
that reflected back can be a really helpful way to move through it.
Yeah. I think that can be really so supportive, especially if that support person, whether it's a practitioner or a really good friend who knows what they're doing with this kind of thing, can make room for the feeling some first. Because as we said at the
Mhm.
beginnings, the guilt, the regret, they're just feelings. They're going to come up anytime that our nervous system predicts is a good time for them to come up, based on the concepts we have, whether or not it makes sense. So if we have room to express some of that and then get the reflection back of, actually hearing your story and being with you in it, I recognize, like you're saying, you did the best you could. And these things just happen the way they do, and it's not your fault. That kind of
Mhm.
reflection can be so useful, especially when we've had the opportunity to express some of that feeling behind it.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
that I think is useful for us to spend a little time talking about too, whether we're doing it for ourselves and or we go and get some support. And I think going and getting support with grieving is always a good idea, in part because the people around us don't tend to have a lot of training for helping us get through it, and we don't tend to have a lot of training for helping ourselves get through it until we've done it a bunch. So going and getting support is always a great idea. But whether you're getting support or not, I think there are four things that are really important to do, at least. There's probably a lot more than that, but at least four things that are really important to do around processing guilt in particular, even regret. That's first is to name it as such, right? Recognize that that's what's happening to us. And that's so useful in part just because it helps our brain and nervous system understand, oh, okay, this experience is that, is guilt, is regret, is shame, is, chagrin even. However we would name our experience that we're having. Then investigate it a little bit. Like you talked about, sharing our story is a way to investigate it. Writing our story out, journaling these what ifs, putting it down somewhere where we can look at it, both in the state where we're upset and feeling that guilt, and also later in other states where we can reflect on it and be like, yeah, some of that's true, but some of that's really just the guilt talking, right?
Mhm.
So second, investigate it, look at it, make make sense of the story, look at the logic of it or the rationale of it. Then address it. If there are things to address, we can do things to do some kind of an address, whether it's, write a letter to our loved one who's passed or to people around them that we still have something that has yet to be addressed, making amends in some way if we're able to do so, addressing it with ourselves, if there's things we wish we'd done, naming those, maybe even writing those down, doing what we can to address the things that we wish we'd done, right? Or that we
Mhm.
wish we'd done differently. And then forgiving ourselves, right? That's such a integral part of this particular piece of grieving, right?
Mhm.
We didn't know more at the time. We couldn't have done better than we did because we were doing the best that we could given what we knew at the time. We can't go back and change it. All we can really do is bring ourselves that level of tenderness of like, okay, you did something you wish you hadn't. Maybe you even did something you think is bad, but you're still a decent person. You're still doing the best you could. I'm still going to love you and forgive you anyway.
Mhm. I feel like we should make that a workbook. Everything you just said.
Hmm.
I feel like
Yeah.
that can be like a fillable, multi-page document to actually help
Mhm.
people work through it.
Yeah. Yes. Oh
Yeah.
my gosh. That's a great idea.
I want to speak to something that you just hinted to at the end of even if you did something that actually was a wrong thing to do, because there's a fine line between people who think they did that versus people who actually did that. And I will say that the line is here. if you actually murdered someone, yes, feel guilty.
Fair. Yeah.
Or if you actually bullied someone,
Mm.
then there certainly is room for self-reflection there and for
Mm.
growth there. And if you did neither of those things, you probably didn't actually do anything wrong.
Mm.
You're probably just in the guilt spiral. And work through it and forgive yourself and have trust that you did your best. Have self-forgiveness, that you were kind and honest, even if your boundaries maybe weren't good for that person because of their unhealthy relating style.
Mm.
However, if you actually murdered someone or actually bullied someone, please self-reflect. And please don't bypass it and say, oh, I did my best. Oh, I was just hurt in that moment. Please actually self-reflect and consider how to change behavior. Certainly seek professional support in order to no longer do that in the future. And forgive yourself. And some of the most beautiful transformations can come from actually sitting in that discomfort. And that would be probably under the category of shadow work and looking deeply into your own trauma and why your trauma resulted in that action. And from that place, the forgiveness can come. And certainly not an avoidance of it or a trying to forget it or a drinking it away or a running away from it, which is the most likely scenario for the person in that camp.
Mm.
Most of the self-reflective people are over here in this camp, and most of the harmful people are in this camp, but they actually need to just sit and reflect and get a lot of professional support and deep healing.
Yeah. I really appreciate that as perhaps a final note for this particular conversation, that there is use to this feeling coming up. Right?
Mm-hmm.
We talked about it as like, it's not often, it's not always about the story that we're telling ourselves that it's about, but this feeling, whether it's regret or guilt or even shame, coming up around the loss of someone close to us, it gives us this opportunity for reflection, which is useful for all of us, whether we were really implicated in the loss or not. And I think it's part of the way that our brain tries to help us heal through the process of grieving and of losing someone,
Mm-hmm.
to give us this chance to look back and be like, was there anything that I did that made that happen? And if so, is there a way that I could avoid that for me or for other loved ones in the future? I think it's a really useful emotional pause. And again, if you are implicated, lean into that, and definitely also lean into the addressing it stage of working on it. But I also appreciate that you end with, whether, whichever camp you're in, forgiveness is a big part of working with this particular feeling.
Mm-hmm. I feel like we could do a whole another series about forgiveness.
Yeah.
Perhaps we will.
Perhaps we will.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks for listening to Full-Time Grievers. Please like this video, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you find out when we release the next episode. If you have thoughts or questions about what we shared, please leave them in the comments below. And if this episode made you think of someone, we invite you to send it to them. They could probably use it. Also, don't forget to get your free Receiving Support While Grieving guide in the show notes below.